Many people who push for criminal justice reform emphasize keeping people out of prison. They also talk about reducing the role of law enforcement. Does that make sense? Our next guest has his doubts. Rafael Mangual is Nick Ohnell Fellow and the head of research for policing and public safety at the Manhattan Institute. He's author of the new book, Criminal Injustice: What the Push for Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts Most. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks so much for having me.
All right, we're going to get into what is wrong with this focus. But first of all, what are the policies that we're talking about here when we're talking about decarceration and depolicing?
I really think it's a wide array of policies with that aim. I mean, things that come to mind immediately are bail reforms, discovery reforms, which really raise the transaction costs of undertaking a criminal prosecution by creating these new compliance burdens in terms of the information that has to be gathered and shared, raise the age legislation, which makes it harder to prosecute teenage offenders as adults, which keeps their cases in family court, which then in turn leads to lesser sentences, which of course can be problematic if we're talking about a population that poses a high risk of reoffending. Various sentencing reforms, which have lowered the maximum sentences or eliminated mandatory minimum sentences, decriminalization efforts. The list really goes on and on and on. On top of that, you have, those are sort of legislative reforms. You also have administrative policy reforms brought about by elected district attorneys, which are increasingly using their purges as a means to achieve the kind of reforms that they haven't been able to achieve through the political process. And so we're now living in a time in which somewhere around 40 million Americans are living in jurisdictions with progressive prosecutors who have long lists of offenses that they won't prosecute, who prohibit their line prosecutors from pursuing pretrial detention, or for pursuing sentences above a certain level, or from using sentencing enhancements. So all of these things collectively, I think, have kind of pushed us toward decarceration. I think the proof is really in the pudding. I mean, over the last 10 years, we have seen about a 25% decline in the prison population nationwide. We've seen about a 15% decline in the nation's jail population. I think things have clearly been moving in that direction, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the crime picture has gotten worse in the interim.
Now, you mentioned a number of different policies. Are all of these that you mentioned bad, or are some good, some bad, a mix of results here?
Yeah, I mean, I think the underlying reasoning for these policies is bad, which means that the policies are going to have unintended consequences. And so, it's not that every sentencing reform is awful. It's that when you view decarceration as a public policy good unto itself, and you pursue it with that frame of mind, you're bound to make the kinds of mistakes that I think too many jurisdictions have been making. I mean, again, there's certainly some subset of the population that's incarcerated today that shouldn't be there. The question is, are we taking a scalpel to the system to identify who those people are and release them, or are we taking a hammer to it by just seeking to release people for its own sake? And I think that's really the main problem. So it's not so much that every sentencing reform or every discovery reform or every bail reform is bad. As I've written many times, there are really good ways to go about pursuing the very ends that these reforms were intended to pursue. I mean, I'm very sympathetic, for example, to the critique undergirding lots of bail reforms. The question is have states gone about it in the right way? And I think the answer to that is no.
You've already referenced the progressive prosecutors and the impact that they have, but I assume that is just one of the ways in which you talk about how this emphasis has gotten things wrong. What are some other things we need to be watching out for?
Well, I think a lot of things on the policing side are proving to be increasingly important. I mean, for one, there's been a long-standing recruitment and retention crisis hitting police departments particularly hard, especially in urban jurisdictions. And so, as police departments struggle to attract new recruits and to retain the people that are already on their payroll, I think we're going to start to see the impact that police have on crime become more muted. At the same time, we have seen lots of federal intervention in local policing. Research tells us that that is likely to exacerbate crime problems that we're already struggling with as a nation. So, under Merrick Garland's DOJ, there's been a sharp increase in the number of pattern and practice investigations launched against local police departments. When those investigations are launched in the wake of a viral incident, they tend to lead to significant crime increases that come about as a result of the pullback of the police officers with respect to proactivity measures like car stops, pedestrian stops, and discretionary arrests. All of those things help reduce crime. And on the policy side, we've seen lots and lots of police reforms enacted over the last few years. I mean, just in the year following the murder of George Floyd, something like 30 states passed 140 police reform measures just in that 1 year period, which is a lot of movement on the policy side, but probably very little consideration as to the potential unintended consequences of that project. And so, as we restrain the discretion and the powers of police in a way that also saps their morale, I think we're going to continue to see the recruitment and retention crisis snowball. And the results of that on the street are going to be felt very soon, if not already.
And your last comment there leads me to my next question, which was the end of the title of your book is Who It Hurts the Most. When all of these policies are put in place that lead to decarceration and depolicing, who does get hurt the most?
It's the people that are already living in the very small slices of America that deal with the bulk of America's violent crime problem. So, we tend to talk about crime in national terms, which is an understandable colloquialism. I'm guilty of it myself. But the reality is that there is no such thing as an American crime problem or a Chicago crime problem or a New York crime problem, right? Crime is very, very hyper concentrated in very small slices of a given jurisdiction. So in New York City, for example, in 2010, 15, and 20, about 3.5% of street segments saw 50% of all the violent crime in those years. About 1% of street segments saw 25% of violent crime in that year. And if you don't know what a street segment is, just think, one side of a city block, corner to corner, both sidewalks, right? So that pattern holds in cities across the country. There's something called the rule of crime concentration, which reflects this collection of analyses that continues to find this pattern where somewhere in the range of 5% of street segments see 50% of all crime. And that includes violent crime specifically, even when you narrow it down to that. And so, to illustrate that, I mean, just consider the city of Chicago in 2019. The 10 most dangerous neighborhoods in that city had a combined homicide rate of 61 per 100,000. The national homicide rate that year was 5 per 100,000. If you take the 28 most safest neighborhoods in Chicago that year, 2019, the collective homicide rate was less than 2 per 100,000. So you're talking about a massive disparity in terms of the safety picture. And these neighborhoods are disproportionately Black and Latino. So those 10 dangerous neighborhoods in Chicago with a collective homicide rate in excess of 60 per 100,000, they have an average population that is Black and Latino, which it reaches 95%. So more than 95% of those residents are either Black or brown. This is really important because racial disparities are really at the root of a lot of the reform proposals that I've been critiquing for the last several years. And so one of the things we have to start thinking about is whether these reforms have worked out for the groups that we're told they were meant to help. And the thing I'll leave you with last here is just on the demographic concentration of crime. If you look at Black men, for example, the homicide victimization rate for Black men is 10 times higher than the homicide victimization rate for white men. If you just look at firearm homicide victimization, for Black men, things are literally as bad as they've ever been in history, or at least since 1990. So if you look at 1990 through 2021, and just look at the homicide victimization rate by firearm for men by race, Black men are at their 1990 peak, which means that we have erased all of the progress that we made for that group on that measure. That's double, that rate, by the way, which reaches almost 60 per 100,000, is double what it was just 10 years ago. And so that's really who gets hurt the most. It's low-income minority communities that are already struggling with elevated levels of violent crime.
Well, we've spent roughly 10 minutes talking about the problems that if people want to learn more, they certainly can get a lot more detail in the book. But what I'd like to wrap up with is you set out the problem. So what from your vantage point should be done to sort of shift our gears back toward policies that will work and will not hurt these marginalized groups?
Well, for one, we need a massive investment to plug the hole in policing. New recruitment initiatives, higher pay. We need to maintain quality while increasing supply. And so that has to be mission number one. Mission number two is to reorient criminal justice policy around the recognition that incapacitation is the most important function that the criminal justice system can serve. And what that means is that we need to actually draw a line as to how much repeated criminal conduct we're willing to tolerate. And so maybe that looks like some modified version of 3 strikes, say 5 strikes, or a point system where you get sentencing enhancements based on repeat criminal conduct. And the reason for that is because repeat offenders are driving the bulk of the violent crime problem. If you look at, a given city and look at the arrest histories of people charged with homicides or shootings, on average, you're looking at between 10 and 15 prior arrests for someone who's charged with either a homicide or a shooting in this country. That's a big problem. And so getting at that means maximizing the incapacitation benefits in order to operate as a backstop to the efforts of policing. I think those are the two most important things that we can do right now.
If you'd like to learn much more about this issue, you can read the book. It is called Criminal Injustice, and the IN are in parentheses there. Criminal Injustice, What the Push for Decarceration and Depolicing Gets Wrong and Who It Hurts Most. Its author is Rafael Mangual of the Manhattan Institute. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.